She stood alone, surrounded by stars and stripes on every shoulder, and chose to speak when silence would have saved her career. The chandeliers above glittered like false promises, and somewhere in that ballroom, a general was about to sign away the nation's integrity. What happened next would expose not just corruption, but the true price of doing what's right when the entire system tells you to look away. My name is Dawson, and I'm an NCIS special agent. The night I went undercover as a waitress nearly destroyed everything I'd built, yet it became the moment that defined what I truly believed. There's an image I carry with me still, vivid as a photograph. General Mason's hand suspended above a $2 billion contract, my heart hammering so loudly I thought everyone in the room could hear it, and his voice slicing through the elegant chatter like a blade through silk. Lock the doors? Now. Most people imagine national security unfolds in fortified command centers, in conference rooms with classified briefings projected on screens. They don't picture it happening beneath crystal chandeliers, at tables dressed in white linen, surrounded by men in tailored suits whose smiles come too easily and linger too long. That evening, the air carried the mingled scents of filet mignon, expensive perfume, and something I'd come to recognize over years in this work, the particular tension that precedes betrayal. My cover was seamless, hair pulled back in a tight professional style. Simple black dress, crisp white apron. A serving tray balanced perfectly in my hands the way I'd practiced for days. To everyone at that gathering, I was invisible. Just another member of the staff moving quietly through their world. But to NCIS, I was something else entirely. I was the thread connecting a whispered suspicion to concrete truth. The week before, my director had summoned me to his office. Director Brennan was a man whose walls told stories. Photographs of sailors at sea, folded flags from ceremonies where he'd handed them to widows. Commendations that spoke of 3 decades protecting this country. He'd sat across from me with an expression I'd learned to read as deeply troubled. "We've intercepted communications," he'd said, his voice low and deliberate. "There's talk of a defense contract being negotiated outside official channels. Everything about it feels wrong. General Mason's signature is on the preliminary documents." I'd felt my eyebrows rise despite myself. The General Mason, the man who led the Kandahar operation. Brennan had nodded slowly. War hero, decorated more times than most officers see in 2 lifetimes. He's preparing to authorize a $2 billion agreement with Vanguard Systems. Our intelligence suggests the documentation has been falsified. We can't move openly, not yet. We need someone inside that room. Someone inside. That's how I found myself holding a serving tray instead of my service weapon, moving through a world of power and privilege as if I belonged to neither. The ballroom at the Willard Hotel seemed to glow from within, golden light reflecting off polished marble and gleaming silverware. Waiters moved in coordinated patterns, trained to be present yet unnoticed. I kept to the edges of the room, my eyes constantly scanning. Defense contractors in expensive suits, lobbyists whose faces I recognized from briefings, uniformed officers whose ribbons spoke of combat and command, a senator from Virginia, his laugh too loud, his gestures too expansive, and Mason himself, tall and distinguished, his silver hair catching the light, his bearing radiating the kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself. He glanced in my direction once, perhaps sensing something, or perhaps I imagined it. Years ago, I'd served in his command, back when I was younger, and the Gulf was still teaching me what war actually meant, before he became the public face of American military valor, before I transferred to NCIS and learned that some battles are fought without ever firing a weapon. He'd told us then, all those years ago, that honor meant making the right choice when you were alone and no one would ever know what you decided. Standing there in that ballroom, the irony felt almost cruel. Midway through the evening, I watched a man in a charcoal grey suit approach Mason. The man moved with purpose, his steps deliberate. He pressed a thin folder into Mason's hands, unmarked except for a single crimson seal pressed into the corner. Something about that seal caught my attention and wouldn't let go. It resembled official government sealing. But the details were slightly incorrect. The eagle's wings spread at the wrong angle. The typeface wasn't quite standard issue. Years in intelligence teach you that small discrepancies like these have ended careers and cost lives. I moved closer, my tray an excuse to be anywhere, refilling water glasses and collecting empty plates. Mason opened the folder and I caught a glimpse of the document inside. Project Harbor Light, the heading read. Below it, an authorization signature that made my breath catch in my throat. I knew that name. Colonel Adam Carrian. I'd attended his memorial service 5 years ago, standing in the rain while they played taps and folded the flag for his widow. His signature shouldn't exist anywhere, on anything, not anymore. My throat tightened. I stepped back toward the kitchen entrance, speaking softly into the microphone concealed beneath my collar. Control, this is Sparrow. Need verification on an authorization. Colonel Adam Carrian. Static crackled in my earpiece. Then my supervisor's voice came through, measured and calm. Negative. Carrian is deceased. No authorizations issued since 2019. What are you seeing? A contract. Vanguard Systems. 2 billion. Mason is about to sign it. Do not intervene. The order came firm and clear. Maintain observation only. But everything inside me rebelled against those words. Observe only. I could already imagine the headlines, the investigations that would come too late, the weapons that would slip through cracks in oversight and end up in places they should never be. People would die because I stood by and watched. I saw Mason lift his pen. Camera flashes sparked around him like small explosions. Someone was preparing a toast, champagne glasses raised and waiting. Behind me, a piano played something smooth and elegant, the musician completely unaware that he might be providing the soundtrack to Treason. My breath caught. Training teaches you to think quickly but move slowly, to let your mind race while your body remains controlled. But my instincts outpaced my training. I shifted my position, catching Mason's direct gaze, and deliberately tapped my left wrist twice. It was a signal used by NCIS field operatives, a code that meant abort, compromised, danger. For one long heartbeat, Mason showed no reaction. Then I saw recognition flicker across his features, subtle but unmistakable. His expression hardened. The pen stopped moving. I watched his jaw clench, watched him process what I'd just communicated. The piano continued. The guests laughed and clinked glasses. No one else had noticed anything at all. Mason straightened in his chair, set the pen down carefully, and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of absolute command. "Lock the doors. Now." The room transformed instantly. Conversations died mid-sentence. 2 military police officers stationed near the exits responded immediately, moving to secure the entrances. Guests exchanged bewildered glances, confusion spreading like ripples on water. The Vanguard executives began murmuring protests, but Mason raised one hand and the room fell silent. No one leaves this room until I have reviewed every word of this document. I lowered my tray, my pulse thundering in my ears. Through my earpiece, I could hear controlled chaos erupting. Orders being issued, backup being scrambled, my supervisor demanding to know what had just happened. But I stayed exactly where I was. Mason's eyes found mine across the room again. And what I saw there wasn't anger. It was grim, weary understanding. He read through the folder in complete silence. I watched the color slowly drain from his face as he turned pages. Finally, he looked up, his voice cutting through the hushed tension. "Who delivered this document to me?" His aide hesitated, clearly uncertain how to respond. Mason's voice rose, sharp as a rifle crack. "Answer me." The aide stammered something about corporate liaison and standard clearance procedures. Mason closed the folder with a sound like a judge's gavel. "This authorization signature belongs to a man who died 5 years ago." Gasps spread through the crowd like wildfire. The Vanguard CEO, impeccably dressed and radiating practiced calm, attempted to step forward with a placating smile. "General, perhaps there's been some confusion. If we could all just sit down," Mason commanded. "This meeting is finished." In that moment, I understood what real courage looked like. Not the courage of medal ceremonies or official commendations, but the courage to stop a machine in motion even when you know it will turn its gears against you. Within minutes, NCIS personnel flooded the ballroom. Guests were escorted out in groups, their names recorded, their statements taken. Mason approached me while others were distracted. His voice pitched low enough that only I could hear. "You violated protocol, Agent Dawson." "Yes, sir," I replied. "You may also have prevented this country from selling its soul to the highest bidder." He walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there with my heart still racing. Outside, winter wind cut through Washington with bitter precision. Sirens echoed in the distance as black vehicles arrived to secure the scene. I removed my apron, my hands trembling slightly, though not from fear, from the weight of understanding what we just prevented. When you work in this field long enough, You learn that danger doesn't always announce itself with gunfire or explosions. Sometimes it arrives in leather portfolios, signed by ghosts, authorized by dead men. That night, beneath chandeliers that cast everything in golden light, I learned something every citizen should understand. The cost of silence will always exceed the price of speaking truth. Dawn touched Washington while I lay awake, unable to find sleep. The ballroom felt like something from another lifetime, yet its echoes followed me. The sound of breaking glass, Mason's voice cutting through the air like a command from on high, the uncomfortable shuffling of powerful men realizing they'd been caught. I reported to headquarters at 6 in the morning, exactly on time. The Navy Yard was quiet at that hour, sunlight just beginning to touch the Potomac's grey water. Inside NCIS headquarters, coffee brewed in break rooms, printers hummed to life, and everything appeared deceptively normal. But when you walk those corridors after exposing a $2 billion scandal, normalcy becomes performance. Conversations pause when you approach. Doors close with too much care. Eyes avoid yours. Director Brennan met me outside the debriefing room. He was a tall man, lean from years of discipline, his face marked by decades of service and difficult decisions. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Agent Dawson, you disregarded direct orders." "I followed my conscience, sir." "Your conscience isn't listed in our operational manual. Neither is selling weapons through forged documents signed by deceased officers." He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gestured toward the door. Inside. The debriefing room smelled of stale air and old paper. On one wall hung a framed quote I'd always appreciated. "Justice is truth in action." The words felt heavier now. The debriefing stretched for hours. Every choice I'd made, every observation I'd recorded, every word I'd spoken was examined and questioned and analyzed until the memories felt worn smooth like river stones. When it finally ended, Brennan dismissed me with words that felt colder than the December wind outside. "You're suspended from active duty pending investigation." Outside headquarters, I exhaled hard. Suspended. The word carried its own particular sting. Not guilty, not vindicated, simply silenced. 2 days passed before my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Mason's voice came through, quiet but unmistakably firm. "Meet me." No official channels, no uniforms. Lincoln Memorial. 9 o'clock tonight? I hesitated. If this was some kind of trap, it would end everything I'd worked for. If it wasn't, it might be the only chance I had to understand what was really happening. That evening, the city glowed beneath a thin rain. I walked past tourists and evening joggers, their voices echoing softly against marble and stone. Mason stood alone beside the reflecting pool. Hat pulled low, hands deep in his coat pockets. "You shouldn't be here," I said when I reached him. "Neither should you," he replied, his voice carrying the ghost of a smile. Then, more quietly, "They're already working to bury this. The files, the evidence, everything. Vanguard's legal team moves faster than our investigators can follow." "Then why contact me?" "Because they're preparing to make you the fall guy." He turned to face me directly. "You violated chain of command. You used unauthorized signals. They'll argue you compromised the entire operation for personal reasons. They need someone to blame, and you're convenient." I stared at the dark water, watching the Washington Monument's reflections shimmer and break. The country I'd served for 15 years suddenly felt like something fragile, built on agreements I'd never been allowed to read. Mason took a slow breath. "I'm not clean in this either. I signed preliminary documents, trusting advisors I shouldn't have trusted. That failure is mine to own. But I will not stand by while they destroy you for doing what was right." "What happens next?" I asked. He produced a small flash drive from his pocket. "This contains the original contract documentation before it was altered. Keep it offline. Trust no one inside official channels." The next morning, I surrendered my badge. Officially, I was on administrative leave pending review. Unofficially, I'd become toxic. Even colleagues I'd considered friends stopped returning calls. So I did what I'd always done when I needed to think clearly. I went home. Not my apartment in D.C., but the place I'd grown up. My father's farmhouse in Southern Virginia, where the only sounds were wind moving through trees and the distant rumble of freight trains. Dad had given 30 years to the Navy before his heart gave out. His flag still rested in its wooden case on the mantel, triangle folded and perfect. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and looked at it. "What would you do?" I whispered. His voice came back to me from memory. "Never mistake silence for loyalty, Maren. By nightfall, I'd made my decision. If they wanted to bury the truth, I would dig it back up. I began tracing Vanguard's financial records, working through public filings and subcontractor lists, analysing government payment records. Years in intelligence had taught me to recognise patterns. Within hours I found one. Offshore accounts connected to a shell company called Northstone Logistics, the same company that had supplied weapons during a previous scandal, one that Mason had supposedly shut down years ago. Someone was resurrecting ghosts. I drove back to DC the following day, dressed in civilian clothes, a cap pulled low over my face. I met an old contact at a diner near Quantico. His name was Jonas, a Marine veteran who'd worked security at the dinner. I'd helped him once years ago. Straightening out paperwork after a bureaucratic nightmare nearly cost his sister her scholarship. Maren, he said, sliding into the booth across from me. You're all over internal bulletins. They're actively looking for you. Then it's fortunate I don't plan to stay long. I slid a napkin across the table with coordinates written on it. Can you access the surveillance footage from that night? The hotel cameras, particularly the service corridors? He nodded slowly. Give me 24 hours. When I left the diner, I noticed a dark sedan parked across the street. Tinted windows, engine idling. My heart rate increased. They were watching. That night, back at the farmhouse, I copied the flash drive's contents onto an encrypted backup. Then I concealed it inside an old picture frame, behind a photograph of my father in dress uniform. It felt appropriate somehow, letting him guard the truth. Hours later, heavy knocking jolted me awake. I reached for my weapon. A man's voice called from outside. Agent Dawson, Federal Courier. Documents requiring your signature. But I hadn't requested any documents. I moved silently to the back window and looked out into darkness. The sedan was there again. Headlights extinguished, 2 silhouettes visible inside. I slipped out the back door into cold rain. Every nerve felt alive with danger. Sometimes in this world, the moment you uncover truth is the exact moment someone decides you shouldn't survive to share it. I drove through the night toward the Navy Yard because if they were coming for me, they'd have to do it in a place still governed by law rather than fear. By sunrise, the Capitol dome rose pale gold against the clouded sky. I'd made my choice. I was no longer just an observer, no longer the invisible waitress in the background. I was NCIS and I wasn't finished yet. By the time I reached the Navy Yard that morning, rain had turned to sleet. The guard at the gate looked uncomfortable when he scanned my credentials. Sorry, ma'am. Your clearance has been suspended. I'm not here as an agent, I told him. I'm here as a citizen returning government property. He hesitated, clearly uncertain of protocol, then waved me through. Perhaps he'd read enough news to recognize my name. Perhaps he simply respected the determination in my voice. Inside, I found Director Brennan in the same conference room where everything had begun. The table was still cluttered with folders and cold coffee cups, as if no one had dared disturb the scene. Agent Dawson, he said, rising. You're not authorized to be here. I'm not an agent at the moment, I reminded him. But you need to understand something. The information on that drive isn't complete. Vanguard's deeper financial records are still out there. They're moving assets offshore before indictments can freeze them. Brennan rubbed his temples, the gesture of a man carrying too much weight. We'll pursue warrants, but right now you're in danger. You need protection. I almost laughed. Protection from whom? My own agency. From people who want this story buried. From those who believe silence is worth more than justice, he said quietly. Later that afternoon, Mason called. They've frozen Vanguard's primary accounts. Half of Washington is pretending they never heard the company's name. The other half is waiting to see which direction this storm blows. He paused, his voice dropping. Maren, you understand you might not get your badge back. I never did this for the badge, sir. That's precisely why you deserve it. That evening, I drove to the farmhouse again. The air smelled of pine and approaching winter. For the first time in days, I allowed myself to simply breathe. The quiet settled around me like an old friend. Inside, the house looked exactly as I'd left it. I placed my father's folded flag on the kitchen table beside the encrypted drives. My reflection in the window looked exhausted but clear-eyed. When darkness fell, headlights swept across the front yard. I froze, hand moving toward my weapon. An engine hummed, then silence. Whoever had arrived wasn't knocking. Then a familiar voice called out, NCIS, it's Jonas. He stepped inside, rain dripping from his jacket. They're releasing Mason tomorrow, he said. They couldn't make any of the accusations hold up. Relief washed through me. Good. He deserves better than being dragged through that circus. Jonas sat down, his expression serious. You two. They're offering a deal. Testify in closed session. Keep details quiet. Maybe they'll consider reinstatement later. And if I refuse? They'll bury you under paperwork and innuendo. I smiled faintly. I've been buried before. We sat in silence, rain drumming on the roof. Then Jonas said, My father always told me you can't fight corruption. Said it was like trying to punch water. Your father was half right, I said. You can't punch water, but you can make it boil. The following weeks became a blur of preparation and waiting. Mason and I worked separately, each gathering what evidence we could while avoiding official channels. Jonas became our liaison, moving between us like a careful messenger in occupied territory. The investigation was expanding, but so was the cover-up. Every day brought new challenges. Witnesses recounted statements. Documents vanished from supposedly secure servers. Someone with significant power was working hard to make this scandal disappear. One morning, I received an anonymous envelope at the farmhouse. Inside was a single photograph. Me, walking out of the diner where I'd met Jonas. The message was clear. We're watching. We know everything you're doing. I called Mason immediately. They're trying to intimidate us. Let them try, he said, his voice steady. Fear only works if we allow it to. We keep moving forward. But forward meant stepping into the most dangerous arena of all. The Senate Intelligence Committee had agreed to hear testimony, but only in closed session. No media, no public record, just us facing a panel of politicians who might already be compromised. Jonas pulled me aside the night before the hearing. Maren, he said quietly, if this goes wrong tomorrow, if they decide to prosecute you instead of protecting you, I want you to know something. What you did in that ballroom took more courage than most soldiers show in combat. Whatever happens, you did the right thing. His words stayed with me as I drove to Capitol Hill the next morning. The building loomed massive and white against a grey sky, looking more like a fortress than a symbol of democracy. Inside those walls, careers were made and destroyed. Today would determine which fate awaited me. The hearing room was smaller than I'd imagined, windowless and austere. 7 senators sat behind a curved desk, their faces carefully neutral. Mason arrived moments after me, wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing. We took seats at a simple table facing them, like defendants at trial. Senator Patricia Whitmore, who chaired the committee, began without preamble. Agent Dawson, General Mason, you're here because your actions at the Willard Hotel have raised serious questions about protocol, chain of command, and whether proper procedures were followed. I felt my stomach tighten. This wasn't starting the way I'd hoped. Mason spoke before I could respond. Senator, with respect, we're here because a $2 billion weapons deal was nearly finalized using forged documents and a dead man's signature. The questions you should be asking are about how that was possible, not whether we followed protocol in stopping it. The room went silent. Whitmore's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in her eyes. Respect, perhaps, or calculation. General Mason, she said carefully, we appreciate your service and your intentions. But rules exist for reasons. Agent Dawson ignored direct orders from her superiors. She acted unilaterally in a highly sensitive situation. Those actions, however well-intentioned, set dangerous precedents. Mason leaned forward. Senator, I've spent 35 years following orders. I know the value of discipline and chain of command. But I also know that blind obedience becomes complicity when the system itself is corrupt. Agent Dawson didn't act recklessly. She acted when no one else would. Another senator, a younger man named Brennan, not related to my director, spoke up. But how do we know the system was corrupt? All we have is your word and Agent Dawson's interpretation of events. For all we know, there were legitimate explanations for the discrepancies you noticed. I found my voice then. Senator Colonel Adam Carrian died 5 years ago. I was at his funeral. His widow received his flag. Yet his signature appeared on documents authorizing a $2 billion contract just last month. That's not interpretation. That's fraud. Whitmore held up a hand. We've reviewed the documents you submitted. The signature does appear to be forged, but the investigation into how that happened is ongoing. What concerns this committee is whether your actions, Agent Dawson, may have compromised that investigation. My hands clenched beneath the table. They were building a case against me, not against the people who'd forged the documents. Mason must have sensed my frustration because he placed a hand on my arm. A small gesture of solidarity. The questioning continued for 3 hours. They dissected every decision I'd made, every communication I'd sent, every moment of that night. They asked Mason why he'd trusted the signal from a waitress he barely recognized. They questioned our motives, our methods, our judgment. Through it all, I forced myself to remain calm, to answer honestly, to trust that truth would matter more than politics. Finally, as afternoon light began to fade outside, Whitmore called for a brief recess. Mason and I sat alone in the hallway, neither of us speaking. What was there to say? We'd told the truth. Now we waited to learn if truth was enough. When we returned, the atmosphere had shifted. Whitmore's expression was grave, but no longer hostile. "Agent Dawson," she began, "this committee has reviewed additional evidence that was submitted during our recess. Evidence that corroborates your account and raises serious questions about officials within your own agency." My heart began to race. Jonas had promised he was working on something, but I'd had no idea what. Whitmore continued. "Surveillance footage from the Willard Hotel, which was reported as corrupted, has been recovered from a backup system. That footage shows several individuals, including senior NCIS personnel, accessing secured areas before and after the dinner. It also shows someone tampering with the original footage files. The room felt like it was spinning. Someone in NCIS had been actively covering this up, just as Mason had suspected. Based on this new evidence, Whitmore said, "This committee finds that Agent Dawson acted appropriately given the circumstances and information available to her. Furthermore, we are recommending a full investigation into potential corruption within NCIS leadership, specifically regarding their handling of the Harbour Light contract." I couldn't breathe. After weeks of feeling hunted, of being treated like a criminal, suddenly the tide was turning. "General Mason," Whitmore added, "your service to this country is beyond question. Your actions at the Willard Hotel, while unorthodox, prevented what could have been a catastrophic breach of national security. This committee commends your judgment and your courage." As we left the Capitol building that afternoon, reporters were already gathering, somehow having learned that the closed hearing had produced unexpected results. Cameras flashed. Questions were shouted. But Mason and I walked past them without speaking, two people who'd stared into the machinery of power and somehow survived. That night, I sat alone in my cottage by the Chesapeake, watching the sun set over water that stretched toward an invisible horizon. The sky turned colors I didn't have names for, purples and golds and something in between. My phone rang. It was Jonas. "You should check the news," he said simply. I turned on the television to see a breaking story. NCIS Deputy Director Andrew Collins had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation into obstruction of justice and conspiracy. The Harbour Light scandal was no longer a whisper. It was a headline. 3 days later, I received an official letter from NCIS. My suspension was lifted. I was cleared to return to duty effective immediately. But as I held that letter, staring at the official seal and formal language, I realized something had changed. I didn't want to go back. Not to the same position, not to the same work. I'd seen too much of how the system protected itself, how easily truth could be buried beneath procedure and politics. I called Mason to tell him about my decision. He listened without interruption as I explained that I couldn't return to field work, that I needed something different now. There was a long pause before he spoke. "What will you do?" "Teach," I said. "Train the next generation. Make sure they understand that rules matter, but integrity matters more." He chuckled softly. "They're going to hate having you in that role. You'll make them actually think." "Isn't that the point?" Another pause. "Maren, I've been offered a position at the Naval War College, teaching strategy and ethics. I turned it down because I thought I was too old, too tired. But hearing you talk now, maybe we're not done serving yet. Maybe this is just a different kind of service." "Maybe it is," I agreed. 2 months later, I stood in front of my first class of NCIS trainees. 23 young men and women, their faces eager and uncertain, still believing that right and wrong were clearly defined and that doing good work meant following proper channels. I envied them that certainty. I also knew it was my job to prepare them for the moment when certainty crumbled. I didn't use a textbook that first day. Instead, I told them a story. About a dinner party where weapons were sold beneath crystal chandeliers. About forged signatures and dead men's names. About the moment when following orders meant betraying everything the badge represented. I told them about standing alone in a room full of powerful people and choosing truth over safety. When I finished, the room sat in profound silence. Then a young woman in the second row raised her hand. "Ma'am," she said hesitantly, "are you saying we should disobey orders?" "I'm saying you should never obey orders blindly," I replied. "Every order, every rule, every protocol exists to serve a purpose. When those purposes conflict with justice and truth, you have to decide which you value more. And that decision will define who you are far more than any badge or rank ever could." Another trainee spoke up, a serious young man with careful eyes. "But what if we're wrong? What if we think something's corrupt but we're mistaken?" "That's the hardest part," I admitted. "You'll never have perfect information. You'll never be completely certain. But you'll have to act anyway, knowing you might be wrong, knowing you might pay a terrible price. That's what courage actually means. Not the absence of doubt, but the willingness to act despite it." Over the following weeks, I watched these trainees wrestle with concepts that most people never confront until crisis forces them to. We studied case histories where agents had faced impossible choices. We debated scenarios where law and justice diverged. We examined the thin line between whistleblowing and insubordination. Some trainees struggled with the ambiguity. They wanted clear answers, definitive guidelines. But I couldn't give them that comfort. The real world doesn't work that way. Mason and I met for dinner one evening at a quiet restaurant in Annapolis. He looked better than he had in months, more relaxed, as if teaching had lifted some invisible weight from his shoulders. "How are your students?" he asked. "Terrified mostly," I said. "They joined NCIS thinking they'd be catching spies and stopping terrorists. Now I'm telling them the real challenge is knowing when to break the rules that are supposed to protect us." He smiled. "That's exactly what they need to hear. The comfortable lies don't prepare anyone for reality." We talked for hours that night, sharing stories from our classrooms, comparing notes on which lessons resonated and which fell flat. At one point, Mason grew serious. "Maren, do you ever regret it? The whole thing. Your career was derailed. You were investigated, threatened, nearly prosecuted. Was it worth it?" I thought about his question carefully. Every day I wonder if I could have done things differently. Been smarter, more careful. Found a way to expose the truth without putting myself in the crosshairs. But would I choose differently if I could go back? No, because I can sleep at night now. I couldn't have before. He nodded slowly. That's the price we pay for integrity. Not awards or recognition. Just the ability to face ourselves in the mirror. Months passed. The Harbour Light investigation expanded, revealing connections between Vanguard systems and officials in 3 different agencies. Director Collins was formally indicted on 6 counts of corruption and obstruction. 2 senators resigned quietly. A defense contractor CEO fled to a country without extradition treaties. The scandal that had begun with a forged signature now touched hundreds of lives, destroyed several careers, and triggered reforms in how defense contracts were overseen. But in the daily news cycle, it became just another story of Washington corruption. Briefly shocking before being replaced by the next scandal. Most Americans heard about it, shook their heads, and moved on. That bothered me more than I expected. All that sacrifice, all that risk. And it barely registered as a blip in public consciousness. I mentioned this frustration to my class one day. They listened quietly as I admitted my disappointment that truth didn't change the world the way I'd hoped it would. One of my trainees, a thoughtful woman named Rebecca, raised her hand. "Ma'am, maybe it's not about changing everything at once. Maybe it's about small moments. Each person who hears the story and decides to do better. Each time someone chooses integrity when no one's watching. Those ripples spread further than headlines." Her words stayed with me long after class ended. She was right, of course. Change doesn't happen in dramatic moments captured by cameras. It happens in quiet decisions made by ordinary people who choose difficulty over convenience. Spring arrived, bringing warmth and cherry blossoms to the Chesapeake region. I started running again along the water, watching boats come and go, their sails bright against blue sky. The rhythm of running cleared my mind, gave me space to process everything that had happened. One morning, I ran past an older man fishing from a dock. He nodded as I passed, then called out, "You're that NCIS agent, aren't you? The one from the news?" I slowed, surprised. "Yes, that's me." He reeled in his line, checking his bait. "My grandson wants to be a federal agent. Keeps talking about your story. Says you're his hero." I didn't know what to say to that. Hero felt wrong, too large and mythic for what I'd actually done. Tell him heroes are just regular people who keep doing the right thing even when it's hard, I finally said. The old man smiled. I'll do that. As I continued my run, I thought about that interaction. Somewhere a young person was inspired by what had happened, was choosing this difficult path because they believed it mattered. That thought carried more weight than any official commendation ever could. One evening, Mason called with unexpected news. The Naval War College is hosting a symposium on ethics in national security. They've asked us both to speak. You interested? When is it? 3 months. They want us to present together, talk about the Harbour Light case and what it taught us about institutional courage. I hesitated. Public speaking wasn't my strength, and talking about that night still felt raw. But maybe Rebecca was right about ripples spreading. Maybe this was another opportunity to plant seeds that might grow in ways we'd never see. I'm in, I told him. The symposium took place on a crisp October afternoon. The auditorium was packed with military officers, intelligence professionals, graduate students, and journalists. Mason and I sat on stage facing hundreds of expectant faces. He spoke first, describing the moment he'd been handed the Harbour Light contract, the sick feeling when he realised something was deeply wrong. His decision to trust the signal from a waitress he barely recognised. Then it was my turn. I talked about the loneliness of standing against institutional pressure, about the fear that maybe I was wrong, that I was throwing away my career for nothing, about the moment I chose to act despite that fear. And I talked about what came after, the investigations and accusations and desperate attempts to make me the villain of the story. When we opened for questions, hands shot up across the auditorium. A young officer asked how we knew we could trust each other. A graduate student wanted to know if we'd coordinated our actions beforehand. A journalist asked if we thought the reforms that followed were sufficient. But the question that hit deepest came from a woman in the back row. She stood and spoke in a voice that wavered slightly. My sister works in defense contracting. She's been pressured to falsify safety reports to keep costs down. She knows it's wrong, but she's scared she'll lose everything if she reports it. What would you tell her? The auditorium went silent. I looked at Mason, then back at the woman. I'd tell her that losing everything feels terrifying until you realize your integrity is the one thing you can't afford to lose, I said slowly. Everything else, your job, your reputation, your security, those can be rebuilt. But once you compromise your core values, once you look away when you know something's wrong, you lose something that can't be recovered. You lose yourself. Mason added, I'd also tell her she's not as alone as she feels. There are people who will stand with her, organizations that protect whistleblowers. And ultimately, there's a community of people who've walked this path before and know how hard it is. She needs to find them. After the symposium ended, dozens of people approached us. Some shared their own stories of ethical dilemmas. Others asked for advice. A few just wanted to shake our hands, to thank us for giving them courage to face their own difficult choices. We stayed for hours, talking with each person, understanding that this was the real work. Not the dramatic moment in the ballroom, but these quiet conversations planting seeds of integrity one person at a time. As winter approached, I received a letter from the young woman who'd asked about her sister. She wrote that her sister had filed a formal report about the safety violations and was now working with federal investigators. She'd lost her job but had already received offers from 2 other companies that valued her integrity. The letter ended with a simple line that I've kept on my desk ever since. Your story gave her courage. Thank you for being brave first. That's when I finally understood what all of this had been for. Not for medals or vindication or even justice in some abstract sense, but for moments like this when one person's courage gives another person permission to be brave. When truth spoken in one context echoes forward, creating space for more truth to be told. Mason and I continued teaching, continued speaking at symposiums and conferences, continued sharing the story of that night at the Willard Hotel. And gradually we began to hear from others. A CIA analyst who'd reported falsified intelligence, an FBI agent who'd exposed corruption in his field office, a military prosecutor who'd refused to drop charges against a politically connected officer. Each had faced their own version of what we'd experienced, and each had chosen integrity over safety. They reached out because they needed to know they weren't alone, that there were others who understood the particular burden of choosing truth when silence would have been easier. We formed an informal network, people across different agencies and organizations who'd stood against institutional pressure. We met occasionally, shared resources, and most importantly, reminded each other why we'd made the choices we made. One evening, 2 years after the Harbour Light scandal broke, I sat on my porch watching the sun set over the bay. The sky burned with colour, reds and oranges fading to purple and deep blue. My phone rang. It was Mason. "I got some news today," he said. "Collins took a plea deal. 7 years. He'll actually serve time." I exhaled slowly. After all the delays and legal manoeuvring, I'd almost stopped believing there would be real consequences. "It's not enough," Mason continued. "Nothing would be enough for what he did. But it's something." "It's accountability," I said. "That matters." We talked for a while longer, reminiscing about how far we'd come since that night in the ballroom. Before hanging up, Mason said something I'll always remember. "Maren, I've been thinking about legacy lately. About what we leave behind. I don't think it's the scandals we uncovered or the criminals we caught. I think it's the students we taught. The people we inspired to choose differently. That's what outlasts us." He was right, of course. The Harbour Light scandal would fade into footnotes of history, a minor case study in corruption and accountability. But the ripples would continue. Students in my classes would carry those lessons into their careers. People who heard our story would face their own moments of choice with the knowledge that others had chosen courage before them. That invisible legacy mattered more than any headline. As I ended the call and returned to watching the sunset, I thought about my father, about the flag that still rested on my mantle, about the values he'd tried to teach me and how long it took me to truly understand them. Service isn't just wearing the uniform or following orders. It's having the courage to stand alone when standing together means compromising what you believe. The darkness fell gently that night, soft and complete. And for the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. Not because everything had worked out perfectly. Not because justice had been fully served. But because I'd done what I could with what I had, and that had to be enough. If you're hearing this story now, wondering if you should speak up about something wrong you've witnessed, I can't tell you what to do. I can't promise it will work out well or that you won't pay a terrible price. What I can tell you is this. The weight of silence is heavier than any consequence of speaking truth. And you won't walk that path alone. Others have gone before you. Others will come after. We're building something together, one honest voice at a time. Your courage matters. Not because it will change everything, but because it will change something. And in a world that desperately needs more integrity, more honesty, more people willing to stand up even when standing up costs them dearly, that something is everything. Remember this. Honor isn't a medal or a rank or a title. It's a choice you make in the quiet moments when no one's watching. When the easy path lies before you and the hard path demands everything. That's when honor shows its face. That's when you discover who you really are. Whatever you choose it knowing others have faced the same impossible decision and found the strength to do what was right. Join us in that tradition. Add your voice to the chorus of people who believe truth matters more than comfort. And when it's done, when you've paid whatever price honesty demands, you'll find something waiting on the other side. Not applause or recognition or gratitude. Just the quiet certainty that you remained true to yourself when it mattered most. That certainty is worth everything.